Maya Rodriguez sat quietly at the corner table in the crowded mess hall, picking at her lunch while trying to blend into the background. The industrial-sized dining facility buzzed with conversation, the clatter of metal trays, and the occasional burst of laughter from various groups scattered throughout the room. Steam rose from the serving line where cafeteria workers ladled out portions of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans to the steady stream of personnel. At 28, Maya had learned to make herself small in places like this. Her petite frame of 5'4" and soft features often led people to underestimate her, something she had grown accustomed to over the years. Today, she wore civilian clothes, dark jeans and a plain navy sweater, as she was officially on leave from her assignment. Her shoulder-length black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and, without makeup, she looked younger than her years. The base was bustling with activity as usual. Maya had come here to visit her younger brother Carlos, who was stationed as a communications specialist. It had been months since they had seen each other, and she cherished these rare opportunities to reconnect with family. Carlos was supposed to meet her here for lunch, but he was running late due to an unexpected drill. As Maya waited, she observed the familiar dynamics of military life playing out around her. Groups formed naturally along unit lines and rank structures. The newer recruits clustered together, their enthusiasm and nervous energy palpable as they discussed their training and upcoming assignments. The more seasoned personnel carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from experience. Near the center of the room, a table of 5 men dominated the space with their loud voices and boisterous behavior. Maya had noticed them when she first entered, their conversation carrying across the room despite the ambient noise. They appeared to be Marines, based on their haircuts and bearing, probably in their mid-20s to early 30s. Their table was littered with empty food trays and coffee cups, suggesting they had been there for a while. The apparent leader of the group was a man named Jake Morrison. He was built like a linebacker, broad shoulders, thick neck, and arms that strained against his uniform sleeves. His close-cropped blonde hair and square jaw gave him a classic military appearance, but there was something in his pale blue eyes that made Maya uncomfortable. Even from across the room, she could sense an undercurrent of aggression in his demeanor. Morrison's voice carried as he regaled his companions with stories that seemed designed more to intimidate than entertain. He spoke about bar fights, confrontations with civilians, and his opinions on who belonged in the military and who didn't. His friends, Thompson, Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams, laughed at his jokes and egged him on, creating an echo chamber of machismo and bravado. "I'm telling you guys, the standards have gotten way too soft," Morrison declared, his voice rising above the general din. "They're letting anyone in these days. People who have no business being here." Thompson, a lanky redhead with freckles, nodded vigorously. "You're absolutely right, Jake. I mean, look around this place. Half these people wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight." Maya tried to tune out their conversation, focusing instead on her meal and checking her phone for messages from Carlos. She had heard similar talk countless times before and had learned that engaging with such individuals rarely led to productive outcomes. Better to avoid confrontation when possible and maintain the low profile she had cultivated. But Morrison's group was just getting started. Their conversation grew more animated and their voices louder as they fed off each other's energy. Soon they were discussing specific people in the mess hall, making crude comments about female personnel, and generally establishing their perceived dominance over the space. "See that brunette over there in the corner?" Morrison said, gesturing in Maya's direction with his coffee cup. "Sitting all by herself like some lost little girl. Probably some officer's daughter playing tourist." Maya's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on her phone, hoping they would lose interest and move on to another target. She had dealt with men like Morrison before, bullies who used their size and position to intimidate others, particularly women. The key was not to give them the reaction they were looking for. Chen, a stocky Asian man with a thick Boston accent, laughed. She does look pretty out of place. Bet she's never seen a day of real training in her life. Williams, the youngest of the group with a baby face that made him look barely old enough to serve, seemed less enthusiastic about the direction of the conversation. Maybe we should just leave her alone, guys. She's not bothering anyone. Morrison shot him a withering look. Williams, you need to grow a backbone. This is about maintaining standards and respect for what we do. People like that, he pointed again at Maya, they don't understand sacrifice. They don't know what it means to earn their place. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Morrison's group making increasingly crude and inappropriate comments. Other diners began to notice, some looking uncomfortable while others simply focused on finishing their meals and leaving. The cafeteria staff, busy with their duties, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. Maya checked her watch and realized Carlos was now 30 minutes late. She considered leaving and meeting him later, but something made her stay. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or maybe she simply refused to be driven away by a group of bullies. Either way, she remained seated, maintaining her composure despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Morrison, emboldened by his friend's encouragement and the lack of challenge to his behavior, decided to escalate the situation. He stood up from his table, his considerable frame casting a shadow as he moved. His friends watched with anticipation, sensing that their informal leader was about to provide them with entertainment. You know what, guys? I think I'll go introduce myself to our little visitor, Morrison announced with a predatory grin. Maybe help her understand how things work around here. Thompson rubbed his hands together gleefully. This should be good. As Morrison approached her table, Maya felt a familiar sensation, the heightened awareness that came from years of training and countless dangerous situations. Her muscles tensed slightly, and her breathing became more controlled. She had hoped to avoid this confrontation, but it appeared that Morrison was determined to force the issue. Morrison stopped directly in front of her table, his imposing presence designed to intimidate. He leaned forward slightly, placing both hands on the surface of her table in what was clearly meant to be a threatening gesture. "Excuse me, sweetheart," Morrison said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone. You look a little lost. Maybe a little scared." Maya looked up from her phone, meeting his gaze with steady brown eyes. Her expression remained neutral, showing no fear or agitation despite the obvious threat he represented. "I'm fine, thank you. Just waiting for someone." Morrison's grin widened, interpreting her calm response as weakness rather than strength. "Waiting for someone? Your daddy maybe. Or perhaps some boyfriend who's supposed to protect you." Behind him, his friends had gathered closer, forming a semicircle that effectively blocked Maya's most direct route to the exit. The positioning was deliberate, designed to make her feel trapped and helpless. Other diners in the immediate area began to move away, not wanting to become involved in whatever was developing. "I said I'm fine," Maya repeated, her voice remaining level and controlled. "Please go back to your table." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "Did you hear that, boys? She's giving me orders now. Telling me what to do." He leaned in closer, his face now only inches from hers. "Listen here, princess. This isn't some civilian restaurant where you can just sit wherever you want. This is a military facility, and it's for military people. Real military people." The smell of coffee and something unpleasant wafted from Morrison's breath as he spoke. Maya could see the small scars on his knuckles, the kind that came from fights and rough living. His pale eyes held a coldness that suggested he genuinely enjoyed making others uncomfortable. "I understand this is a military facility," Maya said quietly. "I have permission to be here." Thompson stepped forward, his freckled face twisted in an ugly expression. "Permission from who?" "Your sugar daddy." The crude comment drew snickers from the rest of Morrison's group, except for Williams, who still looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. The young man shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly wanting to be anywhere else but, somehow unable to extract himself from the group dynamic. Morrison straightened up slightly but, kept his hands on the table, maintaining his intimidating posture. You see, sweetheart, what bothers me is people like you taking up space that belongs to real warriors. People who've earned the right to be here through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Carlos explaining that his drill would run longer than expected and, asking her to wait for him. She glanced at the message briefly before returning her attention to Morrison, who had interpreted her momentary distraction as disrespect. Am I boring you? Morrison's voice took on a dangerous edge. Maybe you think this is all a joke. The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation developing in the corner. Some diners watched openly while others tried to pretend they hadn't noticed, focusing intently on their food while straining to hear what was happening. Maya set her phone down carefully and folded her hands in her lap. Her posture remained relaxed, but those trained to recognize such things might have noticed the slight shift in her positioning, the way her feet were now planted firmly on the floor, the barely perceptible adjustment of her weight that would allow for quick movement if necessary. I don't think this is a joke, she said calmly. I think you're trying to intimidate me for no reason other than your own entertainment. The directness of her response caught Morrison off guard for a moment. He had expected fear, tears, or angry protests, any of which would have fed his desire for dominance and control. Instead, he was faced with someone who refused to play the victim role he had assigned to her. Chen decided to add fuel to the fire. She's got some mouth on her, Jake. Maybe she needs to learn some respect. Morrison's jaw tightened. The suggestion of physical intimidation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Maya could sense the group dynamics shifting towards something more dangerous. She had seen this pattern before, how groups of men could work each other up until someone crossed a line they couldn't come back from. You know what I think? Morrison said, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. I think you need a lesson in humility. A reminder of your place in the natural order of things. Williams finally found his voice, though it came out weaker than he probably intended. Come on, Jake. This has gone far enough. Let's just go back to our table. Morrison whirled around to face him, his expression furious. Williams, I thought I told you to grow a backbone. Are you going to let some civilian princess disrespect us like this? The younger man wilted under Morrison's withering glare, any courage he had mustered evaporating in the face of his leader's anger. Maya watched this interaction with interest, recognizing the toxic group dynamics at play. Morrison ruled through intimidation, and his followers were as much victims of his bullying as they were participants in it. I haven't disrespected anyone, Maya said, drawing Morrison's attention back to her. I've been sitting here quietly, minding my own business. You're the one who decided to make this into a confrontation. Morrison's face reddened with anger. A confrontation? Lady, you have no idea what a real confrontation looks like. You want to see what happens when someone who's actually been in combat decides to teach you a lesson? The threat was now explicit, and Maya could feel the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. Years of training had taught her to recognize when a situation was about to turn violent, and all the signs were present. Morrison's breathing had changed, his fists were clenched, and his body language screamed aggression. Around them, the mess hall had grown even quieter. Some diners had quietly left, not wanting to witness whatever was about to happen. Others remained frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or call for help. The cafeteria staff had finally noticed the commotion, but they seemed uncertain about how to handle a situation involving military personnel. Thompson and Chen flanked Morrison on either side, their positioning making it clear that they were prepared to back up their leader if things escalated. Rodriguez, who had been largely silent until now, cracked his knuckles menacingly. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet space like a gunshot. Maya remained seated, her hands still folded in her lap. To the casual observer, she might have appeared helpless or frozen with fear. But, beneath her calm exterior, years of training were taking over. Her mind catalogued potential threats, escape routes, and response options with the efficiency of a computer program. "Last chance, Princess," Morrison growled. "Apologize for your disrespect, pack up your things, and get out of here before this gets ugly." Maya looked up at him with those same steady brown eyes, no trace of fear or submission visible in her expression. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to come from some deep well of confidence. "I'm not going anywhere," she said simply. "And, I'm not apologizing for anything because I've done nothing wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Morrison's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. His friends shifted nervously, sensing that their leader was about to do something that might have serious consequences for all of them. "That's it," Morrison snarled, reaching toward Maya with his large hands. "Time for you to learn your place." As his hands moved toward her, Maya's training finally kicked into high gear. The calm facade she had maintained throughout the confrontation dropped away like a discarded mask, replaced by something far more dangerous. Her body shifted with liquid grace, moving from apparent helplessness to lethal readiness in the space of a heartbeat. But, just as Morrison's fingers were about to make contact, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What the hell is going on here?" Everyone turned toward the source of the voice to see a military police officer standing at the edge of the confrontation, his hand resting on his radio. Behind him, 2 more MPs were approaching quickly, their expressions serious and alert. Morrison's hands froze in mid-reach, his face a mask of frustration and barely contained rage. The spell of mob mentality that had gripped his group suddenly broke, leaving them looking like exactly what they were, bullies caught in the act of intimidating someone they perceived as defenseless. Maya relaxed slightly but remained ready for action. She had no way of knowing whether the arrival of the MPs would defuse the situation or simply delay it until later. Men like Morrison didn't usually forget perceived slights, and she suspected this encounter was far from over. The lead MP, a stern-faced sergeant named Peterson, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. He could read body language and tension as well as anyone, and it was clear to him that he had arrived just in time to prevent something serious from happening. "I asked what was going on here," Peterson repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And, I want answers from all of you." Morrison straightened up, his military bearing reasserting itself in the face of legitimate authority. But, Maya could see the anger still burning in his eyes, the promise that this wasn't finished. She had made an enemy today, whether she wanted one or not. As the MPs began sorting out the situation, Maya realized that her quiet lunch had just become the opening move in a game she had hoped to avoid. But, sometimes, she reflected, you didn't get to choose your battles. Sometimes they chose you. The confrontation was over for now, but Maya had a feeling it was just the beginning of something much more complicated and dangerous. Morrison and his friends weren't the type to let things go, and she was going to have to be very careful in the days ahead. What none of them knew, what Morrison's arrogance and assumptions had blinded him to, was that Maya Rodriguez was far from the helpless civilian he had imagined her to be. The quiet woman sitting alone in the corner carried secrets that would have changed everything about this encounter if they had known the truth. But, for now, those secrets remained hidden, locked away behind the same calm facade that had served Maya so well throughout the confrontation. The MPs would sort out the immediate situation, but the real test was still to come. Sergeant Peterson's arrival had broken the immediate tension, but Maya could feel the undercurrents of unfinished business swirling around the mess hall like smoke from a dying fire. Morrison and his crew had been separated and questioned briefly by the MPs, their stories varying just enough to raise suspicions about what had really been happening. "Ma'am, I need to get your side of what happened here," Peterson said, approaching Maya's table with the professional courtesy that marked experienced military police. His partner, Corporal Martinez, positioned herself nearby while keeping an eye on Morrison's group. Maya provided a calm, factual account of the events, speaking in measured tones that conveyed neither anger nor fear. She described Morrison's approach, his threatening behavior, and the escalating nature of the confrontation without embellishment or emotional language. Peterson took notes, nodding occasionally as he recognized the signs of someone who understood how to give a proper report. "Did you know any of these men before today?" Peterson asked. "No, Sergeant. I've never seen any of them before." "And, you're here visiting family?" "My brother, Carlos Rodriguez. He's a communications specialist assigned to the 3rd Signal Battalion." Peterson made another note. Maya's calm demeanor and straightforward answers stood in stark contrast to the defensive posturing and inconsistent stories coming from Morrison's group. The MP had seen enough confrontations to recognize the difference between victims and aggressors. "We're going to escort those men out of here for now," Peterson explained. "I'd recommend staying in public areas while you're on base, and, if you have any further problems with any of them, contact us immediately." Maya nodded her understanding, though privately she doubted the warning would carry much weight with Morrison. Men like him were experts at walking right up to the line of official sanction without crossing it, at least when witnesses were present. As the MPs led Morrison and his friends out of the mess hall, the man himself turned back to look at Maya one final time. His pale blue eyes held a promise that chilled her despite her training and experience. This wasn't over. If anything, the intervention of authority figures had only made things worse by publicly humiliating him in front of his followers. Thompson leaned close to Morrison as they were escorted out, whispering something that made the larger man's jaw clench with renewed anger. Chen and Rodriguez exchanged meaningful glances, while Williams looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Only Rodriguez seemed genuinely relieved to be walking away from the situation. After they left, the mess hall slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, though many diners continued to steal glances at Maya's corner table. She had become a curiosity, the small, quiet woman who had somehow stood up to Morrison's intimidation without backing down. 20 minutes later, Carlos finally arrived, his face flushed from running across the base. At 25, he shared Maya's dark hair and brown eyes, though he was several inches taller and had the lean build of someone who ran regularly. His uniform was slightly disheveled from the emergency drill that had delayed him. "Maya. Sorry I'm so late. The drill ran way longer than." He stopped mid-sentence, noticing the unusual tension in the room and his sister's carefully composed expression. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maya gave him an edited version of the confrontation, focusing on the basic facts while downplaying the more threatening aspects. She knew Carlos worried about her enough without adding unnecessary fuel to his protective instincts. "Morrison." Carlos frowned, the name clearly familiar to him. "Big guy, blonde hair, thinks he's God's gift to the Marine Corps." "You know him?" "Not personally, but I've heard stories. He's got a reputation around here for being a troublemaker. Hangs out with a crew that likes to pick fights in town. Most people try to avoid them." Maya filed this information away for future reference. If Morrison had a reputation for violence, it made him even more dangerous than she had initially assessed. Men with patterns of aggressive behavior rarely stopped at verbal intimidation. "Come on," Carlos said, gathering up her tray. "Let's get out of here. I'll show you around the base, and we can grab some better food later." As they left the mess hall together, Maya felt eyes following them. She had become a marked woman, whether she liked it or not. The smart thing to do would be to cut her visit short, return home, and put distance between herself and Morrison's crew. But something in her rebelled against the idea of being driven away by bullies. They spent the afternoon walking around the base, with Carlos proudly showing off his workplace and introducing Maya to his friends and colleagues. She met his commanding officer, toured the communications center where he worked, and even sat in on a briefing about new encryption protocols. Throughout the tour, Maya found herself unconsciously scanning for potential threats. Years of operating in hostile environments had made situational awareness second nature to her. She noted exit routes, defensive positions, and the locations of security personnel with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom such observations could mean the difference between life and death. "You're doing that thing again," Carlos observed as they walked between buildings. "What thing?" "That alert thing you do. Like you're expecting trouble. It reminds me of when you used to walk me to school through the rough neighborhoods back home." Maya smiled slightly. Carlos had always been perceptive, even as a child. Growing up in East LA, she had indeed developed early warning systems for trouble, skills that had served her well in her chosen profession. "Just being careful," she said. "Old habits." As evening approached, Carlos suggested they grab dinner at a restaurant off base in the nearby town. Maya agreed, thinking that getting away from the military environment might help her relax and put the day's events behind her. The restaurant Carlos chose was a popular local spot that catered to military personnel and their families. The atmosphere was casual and friendly, with red checkered tablecloths and country music playing softly in the background. They were seated in a booth near the back, away from the main traffic flow. Over dinner, Carlos filled Maya in on his life, his work, and his plans for the future. He spoke enthusiastically about his training, the advanced courses he hoped to attend, and his goal of eventually becoming a warrant officer. Maya listened with genuine interest and pride, remembering the scared kid she used to protect on the streets of their old neighborhood. "You know, I've always wondered what you really do for work," Carlos said between bites of his burger. "You're always vague about it, just saying government contractor or security consulting. And you travel a lot to places you can't talk about." Maya had been expecting this conversation for years. Carlos was intelligent and observant, and her cover stories were wearing thin. But operational security was paramount in her line of work, and the less her family knew about her real job, the safer they would be. "It's complicated," she said, which was true enough. "A lot of it is classified, and, honestly, most of it would be pretty boring to explain." Carlos studied her face, clearly not satisfied with the answer but unwilling to push too hard. Their relationship had always been built on trust and respect, and he knew his sister well enough to understand when she couldn't share certain information. They were interrupted by the arrival of three familiar figures at the front of the restaurant. Morrison, Thompson, and Chen had apparently decided to grab some food off base as well, and their presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the entire establishment. Morrison scanned the room with predatory eyes until he spotted Maya in her booth. A cold smile spread across his face as he pointed her out to his companions. They took a table with a clear view of Maya and Carlos, positioning themselves like hunters watching their prey. "Friends of yours?" Carlos asked, noticing the sudden tension in his sister's posture. "The guy from the mess hall. And his buddies." Carlos turned to look, taking in Morrison's size and aggressive bearing. "Maybe we should leave." "No," Maya said firmly. "We're not going to be run out of every place we go. Just ignore them and enjoy your dinner." But ignoring Morrison proved impossible. He and his friends made sure of that by talking loudly enough for their voices to carry across the restaurant. Their conversation was peppered with crude jokes, aggressive stories, and not-so-subtle references to teaching lessons to people who didn't know their place. "Some people just don't learn," Thompson said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "They think they can disrespect real warriors and just walk away." Chen nodded vigorously. "Maybe they need a more private lesson. Somewhere without MPs around to interfere." The threat was crystal clear, and Maya felt her brother tense beside her. Carlos might not have all the details of what had happened earlier, but he understood enough to recognize that his sister was being threatened. "Maya, we should really go," Carlos whispered urgently. "These guys are trouble." Maya was torn between her protective instincts toward her brother and her refusal to be intimidated. The smart tactical decision was to leave, but every fiber of her being rebelled against giving Morrison the satisfaction of driving her away twice in one day. Just a few more minutes, she said quietly. Let them make the first move. Morrison seemed to sense her resistance from across the room. He leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes never leaving Maya's table. When the waitress approached his table, he made a show of asking questions about the other diners, his voice carrying clearly through the restaurant. That young lady over there, he said, gesturing toward Maya. She looks familiar. Didn't we meet earlier today? I'd love to continue our conversation from this afternoon. The waitress looked uncomfortable and mumbled something noncommittal before hurrying away. Other diners were beginning to notice the tension, some finishing their meals quickly and leaving while others pretended to be absorbed in their food. Carlos had heard enough. That's it. I'm calling base security. No, Maya said, placing a restraining hand on his arm. That will only escalate things. Let me handle this. Handle it how? Maya, these guys are trouble, and you're. He struggled for words, his protective instincts warring with his knowledge that his sister was far more capable than she appeared. I'm what? Maya asked quietly. Carlos looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time that day. He saw the controlled posture, the alert eyes constantly scanning for threats, the way she positioned herself with clear lines of sight and access to exits. He saw things he had noticed over the years but never really processed. You're not what you seem, are you? He said finally. Maya met his gaze steadily. I'm exactly what I seem to be. Your sister who loves you and wants to keep you safe. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest as far as it went. Carlos seemed to understand that there were things about Maya's life that he wasn't cleared to know, and, for the first time, he began to suspect that maybe she was the one protecting him rather than the other way around. Morrison's patience finally ran out. He stood up from his table with theatrical deliberateness, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Thompson and Chen flanked him as he walked slowly across the restaurant, their boots echoing ominously on the wooden floor. Other diners fell silent as the three men approached Maya's booth. The waitress disappeared into the kitchen, probably to call for help, while the restaurant manager watched nervously from behind the register. Morrison stopped directly beside their table, his imposing presence casting a shadow over both siblings. Well, well. If it isn't our little princess from the mess hall. And, who's this? Your boyfriend? Brother, Carlos said tightly, his own military bearing asserting itself despite the odds. Brother? Morrison's smile turned predatory. Even better. Family should stick together. Share experiences. Maya could feel the situation spiraling toward violence. Morrison had been humiliated earlier in front of his crew and needed to re-establish his dominance. The lack of authority figures emboldened him, and the presence of her brother gave him additional leverage to pressure her. What do you want? Maya asked, her voice steady. An apology, Morrison said simply. For your disrespect earlier. And, maybe a little demonstration of proper respect for your betters. Thompson cracked his knuckles again, the sound like gunshots in the quiet restaurant. Chen positioned himself to block the nearest exit, while Morrison loomed over their booth like a thundercloud. Carlos started to stand, but Maya's hand on his arm kept him seated. She could see the calculation in Morrison's eyes, the way he was positioning himself and his men for maximum intimidation. But, she could also see his weaknesses, his overconfidence, his need to dominate rather than simply win, his assumption that she was helpless. I don't have anything to apologize for, Maya said calmly. But, I'll give you one chance to walk away before this goes somewhere you can't come back from. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. Listen to her, boys. The little princess thinks she's giving me orders again. Maya, Carlos whispered urgently, what are you doing? What she was doing was giving Morrison enough rope to hang himself. She had been trained to recognize when violence was inevitable and, to ensure that when it came, she controlled the terms of engagement. Morrison's ego and need for dominance were about to become tactical disadvantages. Last chance, Maya said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made Thompson take an involuntary step backward. Morrison heard it too, but he interpreted it wrong. Instead of recognizing the voice of someone trained for violence, he heard defiance from someone he considered prey. His face darkened with rage as he leaned down, bringing his face close to hers. "You've got some nerve, lady. But, I think it's time someone taught you what happens to people who don't know their place." He reached out to grab her arm, his large hand moving to clamp down on her wrist. It was exactly the move Maya had been waiting for, the moment when Morrison's aggression crossed the line from intimidation to assault. What happened next would shatter every assumption Morrison and his crew had made about the quiet woman in the corner booth. Years of training, combat experience, and deadly skills that had been hidden behind a facade of civilian normalcy were about to be revealed. Maya's hand moved with liquid precision, intercepting Morrison's reach with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. Her fingers found specific pressure points on his wrist, and, suddenly, the big man found himself bent over at an impossible angle, his face twisted in pain and shock. "What the hell?" Thompson started forward, but stopped when he saw Maya's free hand positioned in a way that suggested she could do much worse damage if necessary. The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence as the small woman effortlessly controlled the much larger man. Morrison's face was red with pain and embarrassment, but he was trapped by the precise application of leverage and nerve pressure. "I tried to warn you," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "Now you're going to listen very carefully to what I have to say." Carlos stared at his sister in amazement, finally, understanding that everything he thought he knew about Maya Rodriguez had been just the tip of a very large iceberg. The quiet government contractor was revealing herself to be something far more dangerous and far more capable than anyone in that restaurant had imagined. Morrison's assumptions about victims and predators were about to be violently corrected, and the real confrontation was just beginning. The restaurant had fallen into absolute silence. Maya maintained her precise grip on Morrison's wrist, keeping him bent over their booth at an angle that made him look both ridiculous and completely helpless. The big man's face had gone from red to purple, his eyes wide with shock and pain as he realized that the small woman he had been trying to intimidate was somehow controlling him completely. "Let me go," Morrison growled through gritted teeth, trying to maintain some semblance of authority despite his obvious disadvantage. "I will," Maya said calmly, "when you and your friends understand that this is over. You picked the wrong person to intimidate today." Thompson and Chen looked uncertain, unsure whether to help their leader or back away from a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond their understanding. The woman they had thought was helpless prey had somehow become the predator, and their entire worldview was shifting in real time. Carlos watched his sister with a mixture of amazement and growing comprehension. The precision of her movements, the clinical efficiency of her control over Morrison, the way she seemed completely comfortable in a violent situation, these were not skills learned in weekend self-defense classes. This was training that came from somewhere much more serious and dangerous. "Maya," Carlos said quietly, "maybe you should let him go before this gets worse." She looked at her brother, seeing the concern in his eyes. He was worried about her, still not fully grasping that she was in complete control of the situation. But, he was also beginning to understand that his sister was not who he had thought she was. "You're right," Maya said. She released the pressure on Morrison's wrist with the same controlled precision she had used to apply it. The big man straightened up slowly, rubbing his wrist and staring at her with a mixture of rage and confusion. "What the hell are you?" Morrison demanded, his voice hoarse with pain and embarrassment. Maya stood up from the booth, her movement fluid and confident. At 5'4", she was still dwarfed by Morrison's size, but somehow the dynamic had completely shifted. She no longer looked like potential prey. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down much more dangerous opponents than a mess hall bully. "I'm someone who knows how to handle herself," Maya said simply. "Someone you should have left alone." Thompson found his voice, though it cracked slightly as he spoke. Jake, maybe we should just go. This isn't worth it. Morrison's face twisted with rage at the suggestion. His humiliation was now public and, complete, witnessed by a restaurant full of people including his own followers. For a man whose authority was built on intimidation and physical dominance, this was a devastating blow to his credibility. "Nobody talks to me like that," Morrison snarled. "Nobody." He lunged toward Maya, his considerable size and strength behind a wild swing that would have been devastating if it had connected. But Maya was no longer there when his fist arrived. She had moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in close-quarters combat, stepping inside his reach while redirecting his momentum. Morrison stumbled forward, off balance, and Maya could have ended the fight right there with any number of devastating techniques. Instead, she simply guided him past her, allowing his own aggression to carry him into the wall beside their booth. He hit hard enough to rattle the decorations hanging there, then turned around with fury blazing in his pale eyes. "How did you?" Chen started to ask, but Maya's attention was focused entirely on Morrison now. The big man was breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. Around them, other diners were pulling out phones to record the confrontation, while the restaurant staff huddled near the kitchen door. Someone had probably called the police by now, but Maya knew that wouldn't stop Morrison from escalating further. "You want to keep doing this?" Maya asked, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that suggested she was prepared for whatever came next. "Because I'm happy to continue your education." Morrison charged again, this time trying to tackle her around the waist. It was a move that had probably worked for him in countless bar fights, using his superior size and weight to overpower opponents. But Maya wasn't in a bar fight anymore. This was the kind of close-quarters combat she had been trained for since she was 19 years old. She sidestepped his charge and delivered a precise strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. Morrison dropped like a stone, his body going completely limp as his nervous system temporarily shut down. He hit the restaurant floor hard, completely unconscious. Thompson and Chen stared in horror at their fallen leader. The woman who had seemed so harmless was standing over Morrison's unconscious form with the casual indifference of someone who had done this many times before. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered. "What did you do to him?" "He'll be fine," Maya said, checking Morrison's pulse with professional efficiency. "He'll wake up in a few minutes with a headache and maybe some new perspective." Carlos finally stood up from the booth, moving to his sister's side. "Maya, we need to get out of here before the police arrive. They're not going to understand this." She nodded, grabbing her purse while keeping an eye on Thompson and Chen. Both men looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world, their bravado completely evaporated in the face of their leader's swift defeat. "Are you two going to be a problem?" Maya asked them directly. Thompson shook his head rapidly. "No, ma'am. No problem at all." Chen was already backing toward the door. "We're just going to take care of Jake and forget this ever happened." Maya studied them for a moment, her training allowing her to read their body language and intentions. Both men were genuinely frightened and no longer posed any threat. Morrison's humiliation had broken the group dynamic that had made them dangerous. "Good," Maya said. "Because if any of you come near me or my brother again, the next lesson won't be as gentle." She and Carlos left money on the table for their meal and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Morrison unconscious on the floor with his shocked companions hovering over him. As they reached Carlos's car, he finally found his voice. "Okay, I need some answers," Carlos said as they got into the vehicle. "And don't give me any more vague government contractor nonsense. What you just did in there, that wasn't normal, Maya. That was professional." Maya looked at her younger brother, seeing the concern and confusion in his familiar brown eyes. He deserved some version of the truth, but operational security was still paramount. Even family members could be targeted if they knew too much. "I can't tell you everything," she said finally. "But, you're right." My work is more complicated than I've let on. How complicated? Are we talking CIA? Special Forces? What? Maya started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, checking the mirrors for any signs of pursuit. I work for the Navy. Special Operations Command. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Navy SEALs. Something like that. How long? 9 years. Since I was 19. Carlos stared at his sister as if seeing her for the first time. Everything about her made sense now, the constant travel, the vague job descriptions, the way she carried herself, her protective instincts, and, most importantly, what had just happened in the restaurant. 9 years, he repeated slowly. You've been fighting overseas while I thought you were pushing papers for some boring government office. It's not all fighting, Maya said, though even as she said it, she knew it was a weak deflection. Her job was indeed mostly fighting, or preparing to fight, or dealing with the aftermath of fighting. Don't, Carlos said firmly. Don't downplay this. What you just did to that guy, that was serious. You could have killed him, couldn't you? Maya didn't answer directly, but her silence was answer enough. They drove through the town in quiet, both siblings processing the revelation and its implications. Why didn't you ever tell me? Carlos asked finally. Because the less you know about what I do, the safer you are. Because if certain people knew that Maya Rodriguez had family, they might try to use that against her. Because I wanted you to have a normal life without worrying about whether your sister was coming home from her next assignment. Carlos understood the logic, but it still hurt to realize that his sister had been living a dangerous double life for nearly a decade. All those times she had appeared with new scars she claimed were from hiking accidents or car mishaps. All those long periods of no communication that she blamed on poor cell service in remote consulting locations. How many times have you been shot at? He asked quietly. Carlos. How many times? Maya sighed. More than I'd like to count. Less than some of my teammates. They reached the base, and Carlos showed his ID to the gate guard. As they drove toward the visiting quarters where Maya was staying, he struggled with the magnitude of what he had learned about his sister. Are you okay? He asked suddenly. I mean, really okay? Doing that kind of work, it has to affect you. Maya appreciated the concern in his voice, but she wasn't sure how to answer. Was she okay? By most standards, probably not. She had killed people, seen friends die, and lived with constant stress for nearly a decade. She had nightmares, trust issues, and a hypervigilance that made normal civilian life almost impossible. I'm functional, she said finally. And, I'm good at what I do. That's not what I asked. Maya parked the car outside her temporary lodging and turned to face her brother. The honest answer is that I don't know if I'm okay. I've been doing this for so long that I'm not sure what normal feels like anymore. But, I'm alive, and I'm protecting people who need protecting, and that has to count for something. Carlos reached over and hugged his sister, something he hadn't done since they were children. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. And, scared for you. But, mostly proud. Maya hugged him back, feeling the weight of years of secrecy lifting slightly. It felt good to share even a small part of her real life with family, even though she knew the knowledge would burden him with worry. What happens now? Carlos asked as they separated. With Morrison and his crew, I mean. They're not going to just forget what happened. Maya had been thinking about the same thing. Morrison's humiliation was public and complete, but that made him more dangerous, not less. Men like him rarely forgot perceived slights, and they had a tendency to escalate when their authority was challenged. I'll handle it if it becomes a problem, Maya said. But, hopefully they're smart enough to realize they're outclassed. And, if they're not smart enough? Maya's expression grew serious. Then, they'll learn a much harder lesson than the one I gave Morrison tonight. As they said goodnight and Maya walked toward her quarters, she found herself thinking about the events of the day. She had hoped to have a quiet visit with her brother, but, instead she had been forced to reveal a part of herself that she had kept hidden for years. The confrontation with Morrison had been inevitable once he decided to target her, but, the aftermath was still uncertain. She knew from experience that bullies like Morrison rarely gave up after a single defeat. They tended to regroup, recruit additional help, and come back with overwhelming force. But, they also tended to underestimate their opponents, especially opponents they perceived as weak or defenseless. Maya Rodriguez had spent 9 years learning to be underestimated. It was one of her greatest tactical advantages, and she had a feeling she was going to need every advantage she could get in the days ahead. Inside her quarters, she secured the door and conducted a quick security check of the room. Old habits died hard, and she had learned the value of paranoia through bitter experience. As she prepared for bed, she found herself mentally cataloging the threats and planning for various contingencies. Morrison would be back. The only question was how and when. But, when he came, he would find that Maya Rodriguez was ready for him. The quiet woman from the mess hall had shown him only a fraction of what she was capable of, and, if he forced the issue, he was going to get a much more complete demonstration of the skills that had kept her alive through 9 years of the world's most dangerous assignments. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but, tonight she was safe. And, tomorrow, she would be ready for whatever Morrison and his crew decided to throw at her. They had made the mistake of thinking she was prey. Soon they would learn the difference between a victim and a predator. The real confrontation was still ahead of them, and Maya Rodriguez was very good at confrontations. Maya woke at 0500 hours, her internal clock as precise as any alarm. Years of military discipline had programmed her body to function on minimal sleep and maximum awareness, especially in potentially hostile environments. As consciousness returned, she immediately assessed her surroundings with the automatic efficiency of someone who had slept in war zones. The visiting quarters were quiet, but, outside she could hear the familiar sounds of a military base coming to life. Reveille had been played an hour ago, and, now personnel were beginning their daily routines. Maya had always found comfort in the structured predictability of military life, even when she wasn't officially part of it. She conducted her morning routine with methodical precision, maintaining the physical conditioning that was essential to her survival. 100 push-ups, sit-ups, and squats, followed by stretching and meditation. Her body was a weapon, and, like any weapon, it required constant maintenance to remain effective. As she prepared to meet Carlos for breakfast, Maya's phone buzzed with an encrypted text message from her commanding officer back in Virginia. The message was brief and coded, but she understood its meaning immediately. Her leave time was being cut short. Something had happened that required her immediate attention. Maya stared at the phone for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of duty settling on her shoulders. She had hoped to spend another few days with Carlos, to try to rebuild some of the relationship that years of secrecy had strained. But, the needs of the mission always came first, and she had known that when she chose this life. She sent a brief acknowledgement and began packing her gear. Her civilian clothes went into a standard suitcase, but her real equipment was stored in a specially designed bag that looked like ordinary luggage but contained items that would have raised serious questions if discovered by airport security. 20 minutes later, she was ready to leave. 9 years of deployments had taught her to pack light and pack fast, to be ready to move at a moment's notice. She checked out of her quarters and walked across the base to meet Carlos at the communications center. Her brother was waiting for her outside the building, his face showing concern as he noticed her luggage. "Leaving already? I thought you had 3 more days." "Work called," Maya said simply. "Something came up that needs my immediate attention." Carlos studied her face, recognizing the subtle change in her demeanor. The relaxed civilian mask had been replaced by something harder and more focused. His sister was shifting back into operational mode right in front of his eyes. "Is it dangerous?" he asked quietly. Maya considered lying, but, after yesterday's revelations, she owed him honesty. Probably. Carlos was quiet for a moment, processing this information. I wish you could tell me more. I wish I could help somehow. You help by being safe, Maya said firmly. By living a normal life and, not worrying about things you can't control. That matters more than you know. They hugged goodbye, and, Maya could feel Carlos's reluctance to let her go. She understood his feelings because she shared them. Family connections were both her greatest weakness and, her greatest source of strength. They gave her something to fight for, but, they also gave her enemies potential leverage against her. Be careful, Carlos whispered as they separated. Always am, Maya replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Her job required her to take calculated risks that would seem insane to civilians. As Maya walked toward the parking area where she had left her rental car, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. 3 figures were approaching from different angles, trying to look casual but, clearly coordinating their movements. Thompson, Chen, and Williams had been waiting for her to emerge from the base. Morrison was nowhere to be seen, but Maya suspected he was nearby, probably nursing both his physical injuries and his wounded pride from the previous evening. The fact that his crew was staging an ambush suggested that he had decided to escalate rather than walk away. Maya adjusted her path slightly, moving toward more open ground where she would have better tactical options. Her rental car was still 50 yards away, but, reaching it would mean passing through a choke point between 2 buildings where the 3 men could easily surround her. Thompson was trying to act nonchalant, but, his body language screamed aggression. He was moving to cut off her route to the car while Chen approached from the left and, Williams from the right. It was a basic pincer movement, the kind of tactic that worked against civilians but, showed a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. Maya set down her luggage and, pulled out her phone, ostensibly to make a call but, actually to activate an emergency beacon that would alert base security to her location. She also opened a specific app that would record everything that happened next, providing evidence for whatever investigation might follow. Maya Rodriguez? Thompson called out as he approached, his voice carrying false friendliness. We need to have a conversation with you. I don't think we do, Maya replied, keeping her voice level while mentally calculating distances and angles. All 3 men were now within striking range, but they were spread out enough that she couldn't engage all of them simultaneously. Chen stepped forward, his face showing the barely controlled anger that had been building since Morrison's humiliation. You embarrassed our friend yesterday. That's not something we can just let slide. Your friend embarrassed himself, Maya said. I just helped the process along. Williams looked uncomfortable, clearly reluctant to be part of whatever his companions had planned. Look, lady, just apologize and, maybe this doesn't have to get ugly. Maya almost smiled at that. Williams still thought this was about intimidation and, posturing. He didn't understand that his friends had already committed themselves to a course of action that would end badly for all of them. Where's Morrison? Maya asked. Too ashamed to face me himself. Thompson's face reddened at the implication. Jake's taking care of other business. He sent us to deliver a message. What message would that be? Chen cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. The message is that you picked the wrong people to mess with. There are consequences for disrespecting Marines. Maya looked around at the 3 men, noting their positioning and body language. They were committed now, past the point of backing down. Thompson and Chen were ready for violence, while Williams was trapped by group loyalty despite his obvious reluctance. You're making a mistake, Maya said quietly. All of you. Walk away now, and, this ends here. The only mistake, Thompson snarled, was thinking you'd learn your lesson the easy way. He lunged forward, trying to grab Maya's arm. But, she was no longer there when he arrived. Years of combat training had taught her to read the micro-expressions and body language that preceded attacks, giving her a crucial split-second advantage over untrained opponents. Maya sidestepped Thompson's clumsy charge and delivered a precise elbow strike to his solar plexus. The big man doubled over, gasping for air, as Maya flowed into her next movement. Chen was rushing toward her from the left, his fists raised in a boxing stance that suggested some formal training. But, formal training in a gymnasium was very different from combat experience in hostile environments. Chen threw a technically correct right cross that would have been devastating if it had connected. Maya slipped the punch and responded with a knee strike to his ribs that she could hear crack on impact. Williams hesitated, clearly not wanting to engage but trapped by loyalty to his companions. That hesitation saved him from immediate injury, but it also marked him as the least committed member of the group. Maya filed that information away while she dealt with the more immediate threats. Thompson had recovered enough to charge again, this time trying to tackle her around the waist. Maya pivoted and used his momentum against him, sending him crashing into the wall of the nearest building. The impact was loud enough to echo across the base, and Maya knew that security personnel would be responding soon. Chen was still standing but, clearly hurt, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side where she had damaged his ribs. He looked at Maya with new understanding, finally, grasping that she was operating on a completely different level than anyone he had faced before. "What the hell are you?" Chen gasped, echoing Morrison's question from the night before. "Someone you should have left alone," Maya replied. Williams finally found his courage, or perhaps his desperation, and rushed toward Maya with a wild haymaker. She caught his wrist and applied a joint lock that sent him to his knees, his face twisted in pain. "Please," Williams gasped. "I don't want to do this." Maya studied his face and saw genuine regret there. Unlike his companions, Williams wasn't motivated by sadistic pleasure or wounded pride. He was just a young man who had been pressured into a situation beyond his understanding. "Then, don't," Maya said simply, releasing the joint lock. "Walk away. Right now." Williams scrambled to his feet and stumbled backward, putting distance between himself and the confrontation. Thompson and Chen watched him go with expressions of disgust, but neither was in any condition to pursue him. "This isn't over," Thompson wheezed, still struggling to catch his breath. "Yes, it is," Maya said firmly. "You're going to go back to Morrison and tell him exactly what happened here. You're going to explain that he's outclassed and outgunned, and that any further attempts at retaliation will have serious consequences." Chen straightened up slowly, his face pale with pain. "You think you're tough because you got lucky?" Maya's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made Chen take an involuntary step backward. "I think I'm a professional who's been trying to avoid hurting anyone seriously. But, if you force me to stop holding back, you're not going to like the results." The sound of approaching vehicles broke the tension. Base security had finally responded to the disturbance, and Maya could see 2 military police cars racing toward their location. She picked up her luggage and walked toward her rental car, leaving Thompson and Chen to explain the situation to the MPs. As she drove off the base, Maya reflected on the morning's events. Morrison's crew had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between perception and reality, but she suspected the lesson wouldn't stick. Men like Morrison rarely accepted defeat gracefully, and his humiliation would only make him more dangerous. Her phone buzzed again with another encrypted message. Her transportation had been arranged, and she was expected at the airport within the hour. Whatever crisis had recalled her from leave was serious enough to warrant immediate deployment. Maya felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded every mission. She was good at what she did, perhaps the best in her unit, but every operation carried the risk that this time might be her last. The skills that had kept her alive for 9 years were formidable, but they weren't invincible. As she drove toward the airport, Maya thought about Carlos and the look in his eyes when he realized who she really was. He was proud of her, but he was also afraid for her. That fear was justified. Her job was dangerous, and the odds of surviving a full 20-year career were not encouraging. But, someone had to do the work. Someone had to stand between civilization and the chaos that threatened to destroy it. Maya Rodriguez had volunteered for that responsibility when she was 19 years old, and, despite everything she had seen and done, she had never regretted that choice. At the airport, she turned in her rental car and made her way through security with the practiced ease of someone who traveled frequently. Her special identification allowed her to bypass most of the standard procedures, and, within 30 minutes she was boarding a military transport aircraft. The plane was filled with other special operations personnel, all heading to the same classified destination. Maya recognized some faces but spoke to no one. Operational security was paramount, and personal relationships were a luxury they couldn't afford in their line of work. As the aircraft lifted off, Maya settled back in her seat and closed her eyes. She had learned to sleep whenever the opportunity presented itself, because there was no telling when she would get another chance. The mission ahead would demand everything she had to give, and probably more. Behind her, she was leaving Morrison and his crew to nurse their wounds and their wounded pride. They would probably never understand how close they had come to serious injury or death. They would tell themselves that they had faced a lucky amateur, not a trained killer who had been holding back out of mercy. Maya hoped that their ignorance would protect them from their own stupidity. She hoped they would be smart enough to let the matter drop and avoid forcing her into a more permanent solution. But, hope was another luxury she couldn't afford to depend on. The aircraft banked toward its destination, carrying Maya Rodriguez toward another mission in her ongoing war against the darkness that threatened the world. She was a weapon aimed at the enemies of civilization, and she would do whatever was necessary to complete her objectives. Morrison and his crew had been a minor distraction, a reminder that threats could come from unexpected directions. But the real enemies were still out there, and they required her immediate attention. The confrontation in the mess hall had ended, but Maya Rodriguez's war would continue until she was too old or too broken to fight. For now, she was neither. She was a highly trained, extensively experienced operator at the peak of her abilities. Whatever awaited her at their destination, she would be ready for it. She always was.